I wonder what is the most memorable or significant encounter that you have ever had. For some of us, our answer may be a time when we met someone who was really, really famous. And if we're going to go down that road, then most of my memorable encounters are going to involve meeting famous cricketers when I was working in Pakistan. The photo on the left, does anyone know who that is? No? It's the guy on the left in the front is David Boone, a famous Australian cricketer who was famous in the 80s and the 90s. And the reason that this particular encounter was quite memorable to me was because this photo was taken just as they were leaving the ground after a match. Australia had been playing a 50-over match against South Africa. Australia had won, and so you'd have thought that they'd have been in a little bit of a better mood. But this photo was taken just before David Boone swore at me and told me to, I'll let you fill in the blanks, but he told me to get out of their changing room. I wasn't supposed to be in their changing room, but I just thought I'd chance it. And he wasn't at all impressed that I was there. And then, anyone recognise the guy in the right-hand photo? That's Imran Khan. Again, he, in his day, he was a world-famous all-round cricketer. But after playing cricket, he then got involved in Pakistani politics. He became Prime Minister in Pakistan, and he is currently in prison on corruption charges, which he claims are politically motivated. But for others of us, when we think about memorable encounters, maybe we think not about somebody famous or the time we met somebody famous, but it was an encounter that changed the course of our life. So maybe it was the first time we set eyes on the person who was going to become our husband or wife. Or maybe it was a meeting or a conversation with somebody that because of the things that they said, it set our whole life on a different course. This term, on our Sunday mornings, we've been looking at a number of different encounters that Jesus had with a whole range of people. For some of these people, these encounters would have been memorable for the right reasons. For others, they would have been memorable for the wrong reasons. For some of them, it changed the course of their life. They were never the same again after meeting Jesus. We've just read the story of Jesus' encounter with the little children. And we don't know how old these children were. It's likely that they were somewhere between 0 and 7 years old. But even if the children weren't old enough to remember this encounter with Jesus, their parents did. Their parents would have remembered this day for a long time. They'd heard amazing things about Jesus. They'd heard about the things that he was saying. They'd heard about the things that he was doing. Maybe they even knew people who had been to Jesus and who had been healed. And so they probably also heard the rumors. Could Jesus be the Messiah, the one that we are waiting for, the one that the Old Testament talked about? Could he be the one? Could everything be about to change? And so they brought their children to Jesus for him to bless them, only to be turned away at the last minute by the disciples. And then Jesus, in turn, was indignant with his disciples for their attitude. Those of you who have been around for any of the Sundays in 2024 will have probably heard me say something about the Sermon on the Mount and how these words that were spoken by Jesus and recorded by Matthew in his gospel in Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, and Matthew chapter 7. I've said how these three chapters are going to run parallel to pretty much everything we are going to be doing this year. And some of us will be engaging with these chapters simply by reading them. Some of us may be memorizing parts of them or all of them. Some of us might be engaging with these chapters through the Bible Project resources, so either their weekly playlist or maybe their weekly podcast. But we're engaging with these three chapters in one way or another throughout the year. And Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount with a series of statements which, right at the beginning of his ministry, alert us to the fact that he is almost certainly going to turn everything that we think we know on its head. That we are going to need to totally rethink pretty much everything. And Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount by making 9 observations about the kind of people who he thinks are blessed. Blessed is a bit of a Bible word. It's maybe not a word that we use very often, but it's got this. It's the sentiment of what Jesus is saying is the sort of thing that someone in the street might say when they look at someone who is living a good life, and they say they're fortunate because. And our list of fortunates, if we were thinking about the people that are blessed, the people that are fortunate, the people that are lucky, whatever language we might choose to use, we would probably include people who are healthy. So they're in good health. They've got enough stuff that they don't need to worry about the cost of living crisis. They've got private health care, so they don't need to worry about NHS waiting lists. They've got a dentist, and they can have a dentist appointment whenever they like. They're people with power. They're maybe people with influence. They've got a nice job. They've got a nice house. They don't have a mortgage, etc., etc. But Jesus gives us a very different list, and it includes those who are poor in spirit and those who are meek. Again, words and phrases that maybe we don't immediately know exactly what Jesus is talking about. But whatever Jesus means by the poor in spirit and the meek, wrapped up in all that he means is this idea of people without power, people without influence, people without the resources and the wherewithal to be able to get themselves out of the hole that they are in. And so for Jesus, when he's talking about the kind of people who are going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, it is people who are at the bottom of the pile, not the people at the top of the pile. And if you were living in the first century, as Jesus was, when you viewed the pile of where people were, women and children were quite a long way down. They probably weren't at the bottom, because the bottom was probably reserved for the people who were actually poor, and for people like slaves, and for people who were really, really sick. But your women and children certainly weren't at the top of the pile. Now, if you've got a Bible open in front of you, and you come back to our passage in Mark chapter 10, if you look at the bit immediately preceding the bit that we read, where Jesus welcomes the little children, you will see that there's a section there where Jesus has been defending women's rights by making it more difficult for a Jewish man to be able to divorce his wife and marry someone else. If you go back a little bit further, you will see in chapter 9 that the disciples have been arguing amongst themselves about who is the greatest. And Jesus brings a child and turns their whole idea of who is great and who is not on its head. And he talks about the importance of welcoming children. If you were a child in the first century, you didn't have any rights. If you went to school, it wouldn't be a rights-respecting school like some of our schools are, where they recognize the rights of the child. It wasn't like that. If you were a child in the first century, you didn't have a voice. There was no such thing as pupil voice. You didn't have a voice. Your opinion did not matter. And so in terms of social standing and status, you didn't have any. If you had a powerful father, then it's possible that people might take notice of you, but any influence that you had wasn't your own. It was the influence because of your father's reputation. And if your father was suddenly to die or to lose everything, then you would lose everything as well. And so when Jesus is talking about those who will inherit or those who will enter the kingdom of heaven, when he's saying, unless you become like a child, you will not get in, what is he talking about? You know, there are lots of characteristics in children that we might think Jesus is talking about. For example, children can be very trusting. They can be very loving. They can be very believing. And so maybe Jesus is saying that we need to love him in the way that a child has such a simple and total love for their parents. Or maybe we need to totally trust and believe in God, just as a child might believe their parents. Maybe we need to think about how children are, money has very little, they have very little concept of money. It's very little, bits of paper, it's all a bit meaningless. And so they can be very generous. They can give it away with no thought about what's going to happen tomorrow. But children can also be really annoying. They can be very selfish. They can throw a tantrum when they don't get what they want. They can be very stubborn. So there are certain characteristics of childhood that Jesus clearly is not talking about. But when I think, what I think Jesus is talking about here is he says you must become like little children. I think it is to do with their lack of status. That as long as we want to remain a somebody, we will not get into the kingdom of heaven. The person that wants to hang on to their reputation or hang on to their status won't enter the kingdom of heaven. And then again, coming back to Mark, if you look at the very next story, it's about an encounter that Jesus has with a rich man who goes away sad because he loved his wealth more than he loved Jesus. And Jesus makes this comment on how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, when we read the book of Acts, we see that in terms of the makeup of the church, yes, there were some influential people in the church. Yes, there were some rich people in the church. But a lot of the church, a bulk of the church maybe even, is made up of people who are at the bottom of the pile and not at the top. Because we need to be prepared to give up all that we have in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. And if you're at the bottom of the pile, you don't have as much to give up than those who are at the top. Now, we don't know why the disciples weren't letting the children through. Maybe it was because Jesus was tired. And the disciples thought he needs a break. He needs a rest. He needs his sleep. Maybe it was because he's just had this draining debate with the religious leaders about divorce. And so he spent all this time with the important people. And he's not going to have any time for the unimportant people. Maybe the disciples had forgotten that just a page ago, Jesus had told them that they need to welcome the little people. Maybe they just thought that their proximity to Jesus gave them some power and influence, and so they thought they'd take their opportunity to exert a bit of their power and influence. And one of the reasons that you can't come to Jesus if you want to hold on to your status is that Jesus takes on the role of a servant, and he expects us to take on that role too. He will say things like, the one who wants to be the greatest must be the least. He'll say things like, the first will be last, and the last will be first. And this whole section in Mark is bracketed by Jesus' predictions of his death. Halfway through chapter 9, and again halfway through chapter 10, Jesus predicts that he is going to the cross. The cross where Jesus gave up all his rights, gave up all his status, gave up all his claims, gave up all his authority, because he was prepared to die in order that we might know peace, that we might go free. That although he was God, he gave up everything for us so that we might go free. Some of you will have heard me mention Jim Elliot before. Jim Elliot was a young American who went to the South American jungles because he believed that's where God was calling him to take the good news about Jesus to those that lived in the jungles who had never heard about Jesus or had never had any encounter with anyone from the outside world. And Jim Elliot, along with his friends, they were killed by a tribe on almost one of their very first face-to-face encounters. But he said these words, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." Jesus tells a parable that if he was telling it today, he might say that there was a man who went out with a metal detector, and in a field he discovered that there was an incredible treasure worth more than anything that he owned. And so he quickly reburied the treasure, went and sold everything that he had so that he could buy the field in which the treasure was hidden. You know, for some of us, when we hear Jesus' invitation to follow him, we want to hold on to what we have. We don't want to give it up. We think that the price is too high. And yet what Jesus offers to us is worth way, way more than whatever it is that he is asking from us in return. So yes, there is a cost in following Jesus. And yes, Jesus asks us to think about and to count that cost. But he promises that whatever we give up, it will be worth it. Let's pray.